ideas, and usually where we jump to if someone really, randomly asks, well, how could church be better? And I think if we'd all be completely honest with ourselves, we've all had this conversation. And we've all had this conversation in the car, especially when AM service ran really long. And we, talk. Well, how could we have church better? If we could do this better, if we could move this around, maybe if we did this instead, that would make church better and it would be better, right? And this is a conversation that we'll have in the future, we've had in the past. But again, to kind of carve our attitude and where our attitude needs to be, let's make 3 points. And all I've got this morning is 6 passages, and all 6 of those passages will be up on the screen if you're not good at turning. But number 1, man's hands like to enforce their opinions. And certainly with the pagans in Athens, they were enforcing their ideas about what God wanted. And Paul the apostle was there to try to correct that. We attempt to enforce our opinions, and we, of course, think our opinions would make everything better. I take us to Mark 7:5 to kind of talk about this concept of enforcing opinions. In verse 5, Jesus tells the Pharisees when they asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? Remember, the Pharisees washed their hands in a special way. It's not something in the Old Testament. It was something they had come up with. And Jesus answered, verse 6, and he answered and said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy to you hypocrites? As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And the thought is teaching as God's commands the commandments of men, as if they're God's commands. Verse 8, for laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do, right? Like the concept is that you've come in and you are holding your own personal beliefs and your traditions as if they came from God, but they didn't come from God. And now you're trying to enforce your traditions as if they came from God. If somebody made me church boss for a week, which is a terrible idea, don't ever do that. But if someone made me church boss for a week, I probably could change a lot of things about our worship service. I'd make a lot of rules. And some of y'all whose hearts are really in the wrong place, y'all are thinking that's a good idea. If you could be church boss for a week and make a lot of rules about how to make things better. I'd make a rule that you can't sit on the edges of the pews unless you have a child under 5. Maybe I'd try to push all the kids to the same area. Maybe I would enforce our song leaders to only lead my favorite invitation songs. And recently, I've actually been asking many of our song leaders if they would only lead 2 verses of the invitation song on Sunday morning. I felt like it makes me get to hit my point more powerful, asking people if they need prayer as a congregation, and it gives the Lord's Supper talk guy more time. Now, I can ask those things, but if I was church boss for a week, I could enforce that thing, couldn't I? There's a lot of hymns I would cut out of the psalm book, not because they're undoctrinal, but because I don't like them. They bore me. I'd make rules about how long sermons could go. I'd make rules about what the Lord's Supper talks could be about. And be a little bit more specific than just the covenant of Jesus Christ. The more and more I think I can enforce things, and if I could just enforce these things, church service would be better. What am I really doing? I'm not trying to make church service better. I'm trying to make church more accommodating to me. That's what I'm doing. And I'm not making church service better for the church. I'm making church service better for me. And looking back here in Mark chapter 7, verse 7, what happens when you start making worship and enforce things that are more accommodating for you? What do you turn that worship into in verse 7? You turn that worship into vain worship. Because who is it about now? It's not about God, it's about me. And every time a rule is made that's not in here, it's going to help you and it's going to hurt 200 others. And so when we have these considerations, we think, we've got this brilliant idea. If we would just do this one thing, everything would be better. That's not always the case. And that kind of really leads me to my second thought here, what men's hands try to do to make church service better. And I've seen local churches do this, bouncing schedules, bounce all around. You remember in 1 Corinthians 11, one of the issues with the church there is they're not waiting for each other to take the supper when they assemble together. And they're taking it like in factions and in terms. And he tells them, look, you need to make time that you can all take the supper together. That's part of the deal. That's part of the covenant. Well, we can have Christians that end up in situations where they just think, you know what? If we could change the times of our services, we could get more people to come. And this is not like something where we've all sat down and had a long conversation. This is not like something the elders have gotten together and had a long conversation about what would be best for the group. This is just, let's every Sunday try a different time and see if we can get more people in the building. And I know of local churches that have changed their times of when they're meet 8 or 10 times a year. But when you're bouncing schedules all around thinking, oh, well, this time will be better, this time will be better, I think, again, we've kind of missed the heart of what church worship is all about. Now, this is an Old Testament principle, but if you'll be patient with me, I'm going to walk it to John 4. But in Deuteronomy 12, many of y'all that did Deuteronomy, you remember this. God talks to them about convenient worship and how it's not going to be tolerated under the old covenant. He says you're not going to worship just on any green hill or any high place, but you're going to wait for God to choose a mountain, and that's the mountain you're going to worship on. Deuteronomy 12:5. God says, but you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of your tribes to put his name in his dwelling place. And there you shall go. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings in your hand, your vowed offerings, your free will offerings, your firstborn from the herds of the flocks. And you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all of which you have put in your hand, you and your households in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. He's saying when we get into the promised land, you're not going to worship God wherever you want to. I'm going to pick a place, and that's going to be the place you're going to have to worship me. And y'all that have studied this book and gone on, what place did he pick? Well, he picked Jerusalem. He picked Mount Zion, and that's the place they had to worship. They couldn't just go worship God on any green hill. And what was the general message? Again, this isn't applicable to us, but I think there's a principle to take from it. What's the general thought? The general thought is worship is not always going to be convenient. And there is not going to be a magical place. There is not going to be a magical time where it's going to be convenient for everyone. So the benefit for this group of people is God picked a place and a time, and that's the one they all had to work around, right? Now, is that doable? Is that doable for God to pick a place and time for these Old Testament Jews, and they could all work their life around that time and that place? I think that's very doable. But if I walk this to a New Testament church situation where the only thing that God has prescribed to us is a certain day, and a certain day to at least take the supper and to lay by and store. But is it possible for the church collectively to choose a good time, and instead of me asking the church to work around my life, I instead try to work my life around the church? Is that a principle I can pull to the New Testament? Now, again, God only picked a day, but the local church gets to pick a time and a place. But there's a concept here where I feel like the humble heart needs to just have one time, and he always knows where that time is, and then he can plan his life around the church instead of the church having to plan its life over their life. I don't think that's a humble heart, and again, I think that's man's hands trying to find the perfect way to worship God, instead of really just keeping things simple and maybe bringing this Deuteronomy 12 thing forward as sort of a principle. Have you heard Christians say this about a local church worship? You know what? We just need more spirit, and we need less truth. We spend too much time talking about what's true. We spend too much time worried about what's right, and we just need more spirit. I've heard brethren say things like that. Now, reversely, have you heard brethren say things like this? You know what? We just need to have more truth. We need to care more about what's right, and we need to just have less spirit. Now, I haven't heard that as much, but I have heard a brother or sister phrase that every once in a while. That, you know, we care way too much about having zeal for the Lord. We need to care more just about what's in the book and what's right. Both of those are wrong, right? And the reason why I know both of those are wrong is because of John 4, when the Samaritan woman, by the way, is referencing Deuteronomy 12. The Samaritan woman at the well comes to Jesus, sees him at the well, says this, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." Our fathers worshiped you on this mountain, and you Jews say in Jerusalem is the place where you ought to worship. That's Deuteronomy 12, right? God picked a special mountain. 21, Jesus said to her, talking about the covenant change, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. That Old Testament law is going to pass away. Verse 22, you worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. That's what Jesus said. So what's the only right way to worship God? Is it more spirit and less truth, or is it more truth and less spirit? No, the only right way to say that is this church needs more spirit and truth. And the only reason why I know that's the only right way to do this is because that's what Jesus said. Do you think Jesus probably knows best about how to make church worship better? If you don't think he does, you need to get out because you're in the wrong place, right? We're all here because we think Jesus knows best. That's why we came here this morning, right? And certainly he's right about that too. Any church worship can be better if we will worship more with what Jesus has already told us to do. And so as we move forward from our next three passages, let's talk about God's hands. And this is how God has decided that he can make church worship better. And my only argument to all of these things is the opposite of Acts 17:25. Instead of me trying to put more effort into what I think would make things better, I really need to just put more effort in what God said would make things better. Because that will actually deliver true results that doesn't result in vain worship. And before we begin, let me just say one more time. I get it that sometimes worship is hard. And of y'all, though, that have children, you know how tough worship has become since before when you didn't have children. You know, when we used to take the Lord's Supper, I used to get to sit there with my head down and think about the Lord's Supper the whole time. You know what I do now? Well, I try to help Emily. I can't take all credit for that. But y'all that have it, you know, you don't get to sit there with your head down and just focus the entire time, do you? There's things we got to do. Many of y'all have sick parents at home. And you are having to check your phone to make sure, mom and dad didn't call from home. Those are real things that God expects you to handle. Those are your responsibilities that God gave you. And there's going to be days when you're tired. And there's going to be days when you had to pull all-nighter on Saturday night. There's going to be days you were up with a sick spouse all night. There's going to be things that happen. But generally, we can come into this building or come and assemble together when we've decided to assemble together, and we can enjoy worship every time. We can get something out of it. But I've got to think of it this way. It's not the church's responsibility for church to be better. It's going to have to be my responsibility to make church better. That's the only time we're going to have real change in our lives. And as we go through this is what I'm thinking about. It's not my own wisdom, it's God's wisdom that will make me enjoy worship more and will help me get more out of worship. Here's number one. I could just put more effort in God's instruction, right? Instead of going to a New Testament passage, let me go back to this Old Testament passage. This is the last story of Elisha. Some of y'all come on Friday morning, you got to read this story, and we had a kick out of it. The very last story of Elisha before he dies is the king of Israel coming to him and asking him, what should I do about the Assyrians? They're on their way, they're invading. I've got to protect Israel. Elisha, what do I do? And this is what Elisha tells Joash, the king of Israel, to do. I'm going to start there in the middle of verse 14. This is Joash saying, oh, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen, worried about his army. Verse 18, then he said, take the arrows. So he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. So he struck 3 times and stopped. Now, before I read verse 19, let me get the story. He already shot a bow and arrow to make a point about something else. And then Elisha tells the king to take the arrows. And the instruction from the prophet is strike the ground with the arrows, right? Now, if we were in this situation, if God's prophet tells you to strike the ground, what would you do? Would you do it? Would you do it a lot? And I think that's sort of the thought that we're about to move into here. Would you keep on striking the ground? Would you strike the ground until the arrows broke? Would you strike the ground until your arm could not lift up the arrows anymore? And I think all of us that are Christians, we look at this story with this perspective. Man, if Elisha had given me those arrows and told me that God wanted me to hit these arrows against the ground, I would have hit those arrows against the ground until my hands bled. We come in and we look at this story like that. But old Joash, king of Israel, is only going to hit the ground 3 times. Verse 19, and the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Syria till you've destroyed it. But now you will strike Syria only 3 times. So Elisha's upset with the king of Israel. He went over there and he only hit those arrows against the ground 3 times, but he should have kept on hitting those arrows until he couldn't stop. Elisha said he would have accepted 5, but 3 just wasn't enough. And I think all of us, when we are Christians and we read this story, we get this principle. If God asks you to do something, what should we go out and do it? We should go do it with diligence, right? Because that's how we're going to defeat the Assyrians, if we do what God told us to do with diligence. Well, if this is true back then, is it not true today? When I read passages like Hebrews 10, 24, 25, and he talks about how we're supposed to assemble together to exhort one another and to stir up love and good works. Do you only hit the arrows once or maybe 3 times on the ground for that command? And I really think, if it comes to arrows, Andrew makes the argument that, oh man, I'd hit those arrows till I broke the arrows. But when it comes to commands that our prophets have told us about stirring up love and good works in the assembly, is Andrew breaking his arm trying to beat the arrows against the ground? Would church be better if I put more diligence in exhorting one another? Would church be better if my attitude was, man, I got to come here and I got to stir up love until I can't move my arms anymore? Would church be better? Well, I can at least say this, the man of God won't be angry with you anymore. And I really do. It's always been one of those things that what you put in is what you get out. Is that not true for school? A lot of y'all are school teachers. What you put in is what you get out. And for a lot of us, and I know some of our work situations are not good or unfair, but for work, usually, typically, what you put in is what you get out. Why would church be any different? But again, man's hand says it's the burden of the church to make church better. But any other function, we say, no, the burden's on you to make it better. Again, I think we should put more effort into God's instruction, and I think I probably enjoy worship service that much more. Does that mean waking up early so I'm not rushed here to the building? And I get it, things happen. But if I think okay, I got to hit every green light on 31 to actually make it on time, what does that do to me? It makes me rushed, it makes me stressed, it makes me freak out, and next thing you know, I get here to church or I get here to Bible class, and I'm so stressed and worried, I've already started off things bad. Maybe that means I need to leave my house 10 minutes earlier than I usually do. Maybe that means I don't turn on the TV until I'm ready to go to church. We weren't allowed to watch Bozo the Super Sunday show until we were all ready. I know a lot of y'all watched Bozo before church this morning, so you get it. But just little common sense principles like that would be me putting more effort into God's instruction, right? Maybe that means going to bed on Saturday night on time. And I get it. I know the world tells us that we have a 2-day weekend. But guys, if you're a Christian, you don't have a 2-day weekend. You get Saturday. That's what the sacrifice that we've made, which we did in Romans 12, is our reasonable service. We give up Sunday, or at least parts of Sunday. That's the reality. That's the way it's going to be. And you know what? I give up Sundays if I get eternal life. I think that's okay. But the only reason why I get Saturday is because Henry Ford decided so 100 years ago. This concept that, I need my weekend. No, you don't need a weekend. You're going to get maybe one extra day. This is going to be not necessarily a work day, but Sunday is going to be a service day. And that's part of the sacrifice that we've made by being here. That means I don't get to stay up all night on Saturday night. I don't get to do what I want to do on Sunday morning. Maybe that means not letting afternoon plans interfere with morning worship. We've sometimes turned Sunday into this day where we're trying to cover 8 or 9 things in one day. And a lot of it's family stuff. This past May, you heard my Mother's Day sermon. Many of you remember that Mother's Day sermon. That Mother's Day sermon wasn't very pretty. Because one of the arguments I was trying to make is we've made so many holidays on Sunday, we've forgotten about it, that we call it the Lord's Day. And if I'm so worried about, man, I got to make sure the crock pot's still on at the house, well, I'm not thinking about what we're preaching about or what we're singing about or what we're praying about. I'm worried about the crock pot. So what are some easy solutions? Some easy solutions are making sure that we put the crock pot on early this morning and we don't have to worry about it. Maybe it means saying, hey, I can't do that on Sunday afternoon, but let's do that on Saturday. I got more time for that. Or maybe even Monday night. Just moving in common sense things that allow me to get those arrows and beat them on the ground till they break. And then Elisha won't have to tell me, you should have done it at least 5 times. But I think that 2 Kings 13's principle is, again, something I can bring forward. Now, I keep on saying it's on us, but there's also a share for the leadership. That it is important that the leadership also puts that same amount of effort into our worship service, right? Let's turn to Romans 12, or I have it up on the screen again. For us in the small auditorium, but the young adult class, we did Romans 12 this morning. But certainly talking here about this leads with diligence at the end, I want to read the whole thing. Romans 12:4 says, for as we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function. So we being many are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching. He who exhorts in exhortation. He who gives with liberality. He who leads with diligence. He who shows mercy with cheerfulness. And to pull 2 of these out, the first one I want to pull out is that leadership one. You know, if I'm going to lead something, the apostles say I need to lead that thing with diligence. And I think that means doing your due diligence, that you're actually prepared enough to lead us in that thing. And I think that goes for everyone, whether it's teaching and teaching, right? Whether it's the sermons, whether it's the song leaders. And let's be fair, it gives some credit for us that lead in those ways. Do me and Jason work on these sermons, or you other men that preach up here, do y'all work on these sermons before you get up here, or do we wing it? I think maybe me and Jason could get away with winging it just a little bit. I think Rusty probably could get away with winging it a little bit, but you would eventually catch us. You'd find out pretty fast that we weren't prepared, right? Now, y'all that lead singing, do you pick out some numbers real quick while Hayden's putting them in? Or is that something you've already worked out on Saturday night? No, for a lot of us that lead singing, we've already prepared, right? We've probably practiced even starting those songs at home. I enjoy getting to practice my song. Ruby comes in and sings it with me, you know? That's something we have to prepare, and we lead with diligence by preparation. Now, what's the one thing in worship service that we don't prepare for when we lead? It's leading prayer. Many of y'all that are brothers that lead prayer here, what do you usually do when it's your turn to lead prayer? And I'm just as guilty. You wing it, don't you? And don't get me wrong, there needs to be the ability to wing a prayer that's being led for other people. 1 Timothy 2 says men are going to pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. That is going to be times when you're going to be asked to lead a prayer and you didn't know you were going to lead a prayer. So there is a need to be able to wing a prayer. But when David and Scott have already let you know 2 weeks beforehand that you're going to lead a prayer for the congregation, would our prayers not be better if we try to do our due diligence and prepare them? Am I wrong in thinking that? I think our prayers would be a lot better. And of us that have had these prayer services in the back when I know the men prepared those prayers were awesome. And I'll even say this. My opinion is that the prayers do not get longer by preparing them. They usually get smaller. And it's because we're a little bit more efficient with our time when we know what we're praying for next. And maybe we have it written on a piece of paper or something like that. And I know where I'm going next. And when you have a job that is as important as leading a prayer to God, speaking to God on behalf of the congregation, is that not something worth doing our due diligence for? You know, I think our prayers would be better if we would try to prep them. And many of y'all do prepare your prayers, And what I get to say confidently is I know which ones do prepare their prayers because your prayers are really, really good. And I can tell you prepared your prayers. And I'm very thankful and appreciate that. And you know what? It makes my church worship better because I get to see someone else put all this time into me getting to worship God too. And I'm very appreciative of that. I just want to suggest, I think that'd be a better thing that would actually make church better. Now, what is that doing though? That's just putting more effort into what God already told us to do. That's not a new idea, is it? What about giving with liberality? You know, when you lead in a worship service, you are giving something up. I really enjoy when Jason preaches because I get to sit down and enjoy it. But y'all that get up here and speak, you know you don't really get to sit and enjoy a sermon. You have to preach a sermon, right? Y'all that lead singing, you know you don't necessarily get to sit there and just enjoy and think about those songs because you have to think about leading singing, don't you? If you head the table or you do the Lord's Supper talk, you don't necessarily get to just sit there and meditate on the Lord. You have to think about, I got to lead people in the Lord's Supper. You are giving something up. You are making a sacrifice by leading us in worship. Paul here says if you give with what? Give with liberality. I would dare say you could actually give more than you're already given. And again, maybe here are just some suggestions of practical ways a church leader could give more. If I'm leading prayer, maybe instead of making David come and hunt me down with the mic, maybe I could go find David so David doesn't have to hunt me down with the mic. You know, when I'm done and church service is over, maybe I could walk back there and just hand the mic over there back on the table so we don't have to go looking for it on Sunday night. Would that be given a little more? It would be given a little more. And again, I know I want to go talk to people. I want to go see people. There's things I got to do. But could I give just a little bit more time? Me and Jason talked about not making Brad come and chase us down for our mic. And, you know, if we have the time and unless we get caught in some important discussion, I could walk over here and I could go find Brad so Brad doesn't have to panic looking for me to give me the lapel mic. If you're leading singing, guess what? You could learn the RJ PowerPoint program. There is some conditions to leading singing. You need to be able to read. And if you don't know how to read, I guess you need to be able to memorize the songs. There's always been some conditions to leading singing. As we move into the new age and we're running out of books, there's going to be a condition that you're going to you're going to have to know how to put it in the PowerPoint. And not just hoping Hayden is there to do it for you. And Hayden can teach you how to do it. Austin can teach you how to do it. There's a lot of men here that can teach you how to do it. It is not hard. And if you work on a computer at work, you certainly can run that little computer back there. And you know, if you gave a little bit more and you said, hey, let me learn the PowerPoint so I don't have to make anyone put it in for me, what does that do for Hayden? That lets Hayden go sit with his wife and get ready for worship. Is that not all given with liberality? In my mind, it is given with liberality. And if we had this concept of giving more and leading with diligence, it really would make church worship that much better. Just some things to consider, and I'm sure many of you can think of other things that would be putting more effort into God's command. And finally, this should be obvious. You're going to enjoy worship more if you put more effort in your life as a Christian. You're going to enjoy what we're doing here today because you've been doing it all week. That's why you're going to enjoy what's going on here today. I just wanted to read the end of Acts 2. I didn't have a go-to passage, but I think this one will work for this point. At the end of Acts 2, when we see the early church there, verse 40 says, in many other words he testified and exhorted them, that's Peter, saying, be saved from this perverse generation. Then those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them. Verse 42, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, the breaking of bread, I think that's the Lord's Supper there, and in prayers. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. That was them making sure each other had enough to eat. Praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those that were being saved. That can connect that to that added there in verse 41. The only question I want to ask after doing that reading, do you think these people had a problem going to church? Do you think these people that were living it, going to the temple daily to hear the teachings of the apostles, selling land they had so they could feed their brethren, continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, you think these people were the type of people that didn't enjoy church? Why didn't they enjoy church? It's because they were living church every day. And Sundays when they assembled was just the capstone on that. That's why they were enjoying church. And if you don't enjoy what we're doing here, maybe it's a good time to ask people to study with you. Maybe it's a good time to do something extra that will help you get re-engaged with being the church. And when you are the church, that is when you enjoy the assembly of the church. And that's more effort in life. Certainly, God has the best ideas to make worship better. I'll certainly be more invested in worshiping God when my whole week is about God. Thank you for your close attention. And hopefully this can at least create a mindset